Okay, so welcome back and thank you for joining us again. My name is Laura Bryant. We have a lot of terrific programs at the Merowith Center. So far, I think Presidential Legacies has turned out to be one of our most favorite series. We featured Lincoln, LBJ, Truman, FDR, and now this is part 2 for First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm sure everyone remembers Jeff Urbin, who was suddenly separated from us, and we're going to do part 2 again. And if you are joining us for the first time, you're in for a great trip because Jeff is very insightful and entertaining as well, and it's going to be a fun and fast hour. So Jeff, I'm going to turn this over to you and take it away.
Well, thank
Spirit
you, Laura.
and all.
The way you said that made it sound as if I passed away. It was just a technology glitch. I wasn't spirited away or anything. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Sorry to keep you waiting. Today, we're going to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt Part 2. Last time, if you saw, we talked about Eleanor Roosevelt and the personality development and the challenges, the betrayal, the compassion, and things that helped to shape her personality. Today, we're going to go over that really quickly a little bit, just to give you a reminder and a refresher of that. And I'm going to focus on a couple of turning points in her life, and then we will talk about some of the techniques that she used to get the things that she got done. And those are pretty interesting. Many of them you can use yourself. The summer season is upon us, and you will be having to deal with many people. And some of them are more fun to deal with than others, as you know. And Mrs. Roosevelt had some tricks and techniques for that as well. So Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, known around the world in her own time and also in our time as a champion of human rights and social justice. And this year happens to be the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I don't know if you've ever thought about doing a program on that, Laura, but that might be something else we could do. I never miss an opportunity to promote myself when it comes to these programs. I don't know if anybody ever noticed that. I try to keep it subtle, but you know, there you are. So Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, born October 11th, 1884 in New York City. Her mother, Anna Hall, was a big fancy socialite in New York, didn't think Eleanor was a particularly attractive child, and actually referred to her as Granny, because as a 3 or 4-year-old, to her mother, she was acting like a little old lady. Her father was a neglected alcoholic who would get drunk and then totally forget about Eleanor. And the story we always talk about with that is they were going to have a big daddy-daughter day in New York, and they go in. Very first place her father stops is a bar. He says, just sit right here, Eleanor. I'll be right back. And there she sits. And almost 2 hours later, she pulls on the doorman's collar and a cuff and says, hey, when's my dad coming out from this meeting? And turns out he'd gotten drunk and they'd sent him out the back home in a taxi. So by the time she's 10, she's an orphan. And she's bounced around from family member to family member to family member. She ends up living with a grandma, Grandma Hall, her mom's mom, in a place called Tivoli, New York, which is about 25 miles north of where I am at this point right now in Hyde Park. And there she also has 2 alcoholic uncles. And these uncles end up shooting at her from the windows just to scare her, just to, you know, see her jump. And so her grandma says, well, that's not such a good thing. We got to get this kid out of here. So she packs her up at the age of 15 and off she goes to Allen Wood's school. And over in England, in Allen Wood's school, she meets this woman right here, a woman by the name of Madame Silvestri, who is the headmistress at the Allen Wood's school. And this is really one of the first turning points in Eleanor Roosevelt's life, because Madame Silvestri takes an interest in Eleanor the way no one else ever has. She tells Eleanor, hey, you're pretty smart. You know, you're pretty personable. You know, you got a lot to offer. You should talk about what it is that you've got on your mind. You should, you know, write about what it is that you want to do and where you want to go and the people you want to meet and those sorts of things. And she begins to pull Eleanor out of her shell. So this is turning point number 1 for Eleanor. She begins to gain a sense of confidence and self-awareness that has never really been cultivated in her before. And this happens when she's about 15, and it continues on until she is 18, when she graduates, and she has to come back to the States. And she says those were the happiest 3 years of her life, the time spent with Madame Silvestri and, beginning to explore herself. She comes back to New York, gets a job in a tenement house, which is what people sometimes did back in those days, teaching skills and things to immigrant families that were living down in the tenement houses. It was sort of seen as a social welfare outreach kind of thing from the upper class folks to maybe feel a little bit less guilty about being so well off. And while she's in New York City, she bumps into an old friend and cousin of hers, none other than Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt is in New York. He is working at a law firm, and they reconnect. And when they do, sparks fly. They fall in love. And Franklin refers to her as my angel, which is a pretty big promotion from Granny, right? So that's pretty good. And when they first fall in love, it's exactly what you want this to be in a young couple. It's, head over heels, it's, fireworks, they go on long walks, they gaze into each other's eyes, they read poetry to each other, all that sort of sappy love stuff that you would want in, a young couple. And they decide they're going to get married. He's 21, she's 19. And when he tells his mom says, whoa, wait a minute now, hold on a second here. Eleanor is all right, but, you're awfully young, you guys. And his mother takes him on a 6-week cruise through the Caribbean, month and a half, hoping that he'll forget about Eleanor in this time. Well, he does not forget about Eleanor in this time. And in fact, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And when they get back, they decide they're going to get married on March 17th, 1905. And the reason that they picked St. Patrick's Day is not because they love leprechauns or, were particularly interested in Irish culture or anything like that. It happened to be the day that her Uncle Teddy, her favorite uncle, was available to walk her down the aisle at the wedding. And she later says this is one of the biggest mistakes she ever makes, because on her wedding day, everybody's paying attention to Uncle Teddy, not her, right? She should be the center of attention, and she's not. So they go to Europe. 3 months, they have a honeymoon, right? Must be nice, okay? And they come back. His mom has built a townhouse in New York City. They move in. There's an apartment right next door for his mom, so that they're all both in the same building. Doors on each floor with the locks on mom's side, so she can stop in on the newlyweds anytime she likes. And they begin to raise a family. They have 6 children, 5 of which live to be adults. Franklin Jr., the first, dies within a year of birth due to respiratory problems. And so Eleanor spends the first 10 years of her marriage either having just had a baby or about to have a baby. And it's a very busy time, of course, for them. Now, Franklin starts off his political career in the New York State Senate. And he is up in Albany, our state capital. And while he's up there, he gets involved with the political machine, the Democratic political machine, and he puts Woodrow Wilson's name in nomination for the presidency. When Woodrow Wilson wins the presidency, he nominates Franklin Roosevelt to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And it's the favorite job that FDR has. He loves being Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He goes down to Washington, moves the family down there, and the job of Assistant Secretary of the Navy basically has 2 parts. Part 1 is that you get to travel all around the world to all the various naval bases, American naval bases, checking out what's going on with the ships and the men and the sailors and all that sort of stuff. Franklin loves that. He loves the ocean. He loves ships. He loves to be at sea, and he loves to go to all of these places. Of course, Eleanor's got 5 kids at home. She's not able to travel with him on this. So she stays at home with the kids. And then when he is in town, the other half of the job is that he has to go to all of the big cocktail parties in Washington, D.C. to, rub elbows with the mucky mucks in Washington, the power brokers and such, and keep, them interested in the Navy. Eleanor Roosevelt does not like to do this. because she doesn't like to be around alcohol, right, for obvious reasons. And so what ends up happening is she finally says, well, you know what, Franklin, I can't go with you. You need to go with somebody else. And he says, well, who can I possibly go with? And so she recommends her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. And Franklin and Lucy Mercer begin to go to these parties, and they begin to have an affair. Now, we don't know exactly when it began, but we do know exactly when it ended. It ended when Franklin came back from the end of the First World War, had a touch of the big influenza that was going on there. It was turning into pneumonia. So he drops all the stuff in the lobby of their apartment and he says, I'm going upstairs. I don't feel so good. So he goes upstairs, and Eleanor, the dutiful wife, begins to unpack his stuff, and she finds a satchel of love letters from Lucy Mercer. So she says to Franklin, hey, look what I found. And if you love this woman as much as these letters seem to indicate, you need to be with her, not with me. She offers Franklin a divorce, which he promptly turns down. And he turns it down because Louis Howe, his political advisor, says, hey, you get divorced, your political career is over, right? You can't run a marriage. How are you going to run a country, right? Nobody's going to vote for you. Again, we're talking in the 1920s. So that was one reason. And the second, more important reason is his mother says, no. You found her, you married her, you cheated on her. You better fix this, because if you don't, I will cut you off from the Roosevelt family fortune. And so they decide to stay together. And Franklin promises Eleanor he will never see Lucy Mercer again, but he does one of these finger cross things, you know? So this is a second turning point in Eleanor Roosevelt's life, because by having the marriage break down from being the lovey-dovey, you know, sparkly eyes, all that sort of stuff, into more of a political partnership, they become really more like two pistons in the same engine, working side by side and propelling themselves along, and the things that they want to do, the reforms that they want to create, propelling those along. So it becomes less of the lovey-dovey relationship and more of the political partnership that everybody talks about so much later on. And this is a turning point for Eleanor because it gives her leverage inside the marriage. What this does is it allows her to say to Franklin, look, you know what? I'm going to do what I want to do. And there's not much you can do to stop me, because you wouldn't even have a political career right now if it wasn't for me. And if I didn't, stay with you and we had gone through with this divorce, you'd be cut off from the Roosevelt family fortune. So let me do what I need to do. It also gave her a sense of independence because she was sort of freed up from having to have all the emotional involvement in the marriage, right? And think about that, right? If you don't have emotional involvement in your marriage, that takes a lot of emotion, a lot of energy, okay? And so she's freed up from that, and now she's able to kind of pursue some things on her own. Well, just a few short years later, turning point 3 comes along, and that is 1921, just 3 or 4 years after the war ends. Franklin Roosevelt contracts polio, and he is unable to walk. Now, when he first gets polio, it impacts his entire body, and he's not even able to lift a soup spoon. That's how weak he was. Over the next 6 or 8 weeks, this polio begins to settle in his legs. He regains his upper body strength, and he's unable to walk. So he returns to Hyde Park with the goal of learning how to walk again. And while he's doing this, Eleanor Roosevelt takes on some of his public activities. In fact, she takes on all of his public activities. And so he comes back to Hyde Park, and for 7 years, he tries to teach himself how to walk again. He tries to learn how to be able to walk without crutches, without a wheelchair, maybe just using a cane. He's never quite fully successful. But during that 7 years, Mrs. Roosevelt is going around the country making speeches on his behalf. She is giving interviews on his behalf. She is writing articles on his behalf. She is going to meetings on his behalf. And what she's doing is she's keeping Franklin Roosevelt's name alive in not only the state Democratic circles, but in the national Democratic circles as well. And as a result of this, she is doing several things. One is she's learning all about politics. She's learning about how to get things done, how to twist arms, how to roll logs, as they say. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. She's learning the skills of public speaking. Now, keep in mind, Mrs. Roosevelt had that high, squeaky Eleanor Roosevelt voice, and went something like that, and it wasn't always pleasant for people to listen to. So she understood that she had to get up there, make her point, and sit down. But she's developing her political skills. She's developing her public speaking skills. She's developing her writing skills. All this in trying to keep Franklin Roosevelt's name alive in Democratic politics. Because she's traveling around throughout the state and throughout the country, she is also creating an incredible network of people who she understands, who understand her, and she's able to work with to advance her social policies and agendas. So this is a really important turning point because she is building on that confidence. She's building that she gets from Madame Silvestri. She's building on the self-awareness that she gets from Madame Silvestri. She's building on the leverage that she has from the affair that happened in the marriage and also from that independence. And now she's developing her political public speaking skills, her political skills, her writing skills, and a national network of people that she can use as allies in her causes. FDR returns to politics in 1928. He runs for the governorship of New York, and he has his eyes set on the presidency. He's governor for 4 years here in New York. And again, Eleanor is now very close to the power of New York State, right? He's the governor, she's the first lady. So she's in on a lot of the things that are going on in the state. This is important because New York State was the largest state in the Union at the time. And so running New York State was kind of like running a small country. And that's generally what gave people the experience then to go on to become president. So Mrs. Roosevelt is now close to the centers of power in the state. And when President Roosevelt becomes president, this explodes. Now she has the ear of the President of the United States. So turning point number 4 is when she becomes First Lady, after President Roosevelt becomes president, she's at first very nervous about it, right? State, I can handle the state, but now we're running the whole country. And she decides that she is going to recreate the role of the First Lady in her own image. And so she's not exactly happy when he wins, but she doesn't let it throw her. She says, all right, you know what? I'm going to use this as a platform. I am now, very close to the power center of the United States of America. I've married to the president. This is not just any president. This is a president that is actively seeking to get things done. He's very much a progressive, and he's going to be president for 12 years. So, of course, she doesn't know that at that point, but that's the way it turns out. So she has access to power for an extended period of time and a willing partner who is going to listen to her. So as First Lady, she begins to restructure the role that she's playing there in the White House. So she is the First Lady to hold her own press conferences. Now, this was an important thing because no First Lady had ever held press conferences before. Maybe there would be an article here or there about them, along the way, but she was the first to sit down with members of the press. And she only would allow women correspondents to cover her. And this was a direct result of President Roosevelt, who at the time would only allow men to cover him. So she said, well, that's not fair. You're only going to let men go to your press conference, then I'm only going to let women come to my press conference. And this was really important because it gave women in journalism a huge step forward in their career. Because if you were a major newspaper, like in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, you needed to have a female correspondent to be able to cover Eleanor Roosevelt. So in the 1930s, of course, in the Depression, women were one of the first people fired if if you got married, then it was thought your husband could take care of you. Many school teachers, female school teachers, had in their contracts that if they got married during the school year, that was grounds for being fired, because then they would take the job away from her and they would give it to another single woman, or let's say a man that needed the job. So Eleanor Roosevelt really helps to help women establish themselves in journalism. In her first year as First Lady, she travels 144,000 miles for the president. She is his eyes, his ears, and his legs. She goes out there all across the country, reconnecting with these folks that she had met over the time that he was trying to get back and better from polio. And she goes around the country and she is able to report back to the president on what she's seeing. And he trains her. He says, listen, Eleanor, when you go to Kansas City, right, have the conductor tell you, Mrs. Roosevelt, 10 minutes out from Kansas City, and go out on the back of the train. What do you see? Right? Because when you're First Lady, they're going to take you to all the ritzy places, all the places that have been all spiffed up, and they're going to show you all the most wonderful places, right? Kind of like, when you have visitors to your house, right? So, the Johnsons are coming over. Okay, so you take all your crap and you shove it into 1 or 2 rooms and you try to isolate them to only stay in, those certain parts of the house. Same thing for First Lady. But Roosevelt wanted a real sense of what things were like. So when she was out on the back of that train, she was looking at the conditions of the houses, the toys that the kids were playing in. How were the clothes that were hanging on the clothesline? Did they have a lot of patches? Were they holey? Were they nice? Were they outdated? These are all going to give you a better indication of what it's like there in that community when you get there. He also told her, if you go to a soup kitchen and they tell you that they're cooking gumbo, you stick your nose in the pot and make sure it's not oatmeal, because we're paying for gumbo, not oatmeal. So it's down to that level of detail that Mrs. Roosevelt became the president's basically informer, right? Going out there and saying, look, Franklin, here's where I went all these places. Here's how your New Deal is working out there. Here's how you should fix this. Here's what you should continue over there. And that became that partnership that goes back and forth that way. He wrote a My Day column from 1935 to 1962. And she just basically wrote about whatever was on her mind for a particular day. Some people call it the world's first blog, because she'd sit there and say, well, today I went into Poughkeepsie, the local city here in the Hudson Valley, and I bought some Beefy Boy tomatoes, and boy, were they big and yummy and juicy. The farmers must be doing so well, la-di-da. And off it goes, syndicated in newspapers all across the country. The next day, she might meet an ambassador, a king, someone like that. Sit down, type it up. Oh, met with the king yesterday. He's telling me this and that. So she let people in on what was going on. And in a lot of ways, she demystified the first family and let people know, what does the president do every day? And this is the kinds of things that she was talking about. He also held his feet to the fire. So on social issues. So if she didn't think he was doing enough, she would prod him. Now, she would never sit down and say, Franklin, you need to do this, this, and that. What she would do is she would say very subtly, like they would be, in the sitting room at night, and maybe she was, doing her crocheting, and she might stop, put her glasses down, and say, Franklin, surely you're not thinking of doing blah, 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 right? And he would be like, oh, well, of course not. No, that would be silly. I wouldn't do that, right? And so she was able to prod him and move him and direct him in ways such as that. And one of the things we're learning about, which is so exciting from a historian standpoint, is we are learning more and more each year about how involved Mrs. Roosevelt was in the administration, not just in the New Deal and the Great Depression, but also in the Second World War. She was very, very actively involved in that partnership with President Roosevelt. Now, you may have seen the Ken Burns film that came out about 3 or 4 years ago on the 3 Roosevelts. So it was Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and who's right up there with them? Eleanor Roosevelt. So you're beginning to see that more and more, and you will begin to see that. She traveled to England twice during the war. And this was really important for morale. The British were just 20 miles off the coast of Europe, which was dominated by, of course, the Nazis. And so for the First Lady of the United States to go to a country just 20 miles off the coast of Nazi-dominated Europe and, walk freely among the people and talk to folks and, work to cheer them up. This was a huge boost in morale for the British people who were really, staring down the gun of Hitler's aggression. She also traveled throughout the South Pacific on one big journey down there. And she traveled 30,000 miles and she was seen by over 150,000 troops. And here is a picture of her meeting with some sailors. She met with white sailors. She met with black sailors. She would visit the hospitals that were there. And this, again, was a huge boost to morale because the sailors and the soldiers that were fighting on those islands way out in the Pacific, they were telling themselves, wow, we must be making progress. We must be turning the tide of the war. We must be doing well, or they wouldn't let the First Lady of the United States be here. We must be in a relatively safe and better condition in terms of our presence here in the war. And the Navy at first did not want her to do this. They're like, look, the last thing we need is the First Lady out there in the war zone. We got to protect her. But they later said it was like having an entire new fleet come to their aid because it boosted the morale and it got the guys, jazzed up about what it was that they were doing out there. And I don't remember if I mentioned, but she lost 30 pounds on that trip. So when I told my wife that, she was like, oh, guess where you're going? The South Pacific. Anyway, so I said, no, I'm going to Dairy Queen. So anyway, there you are. Now, she also took the lead on civil rights in the administration. And there's a famous story about Marian Anderson, who was an African-American singer, and she was supposed to give a concert at a place called Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., but they wouldn't let her sing there because she was Black. And Washington was a segregated city. So they wouldn't let her sing there. And when Eleanor Roosevelt found out about that, she's like, well, what's that all about? And Marian Anderson, who was her friend, said, well, they won't let me sing because I'm Black. It's a segregated venue. And Eleanor said, well, who's running that show anyway? And Marian Anderson said, well, the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. And Eleanor said, wait a minute, I'm a member of that organization. And she resigned her membership in protest over that. Now, 6 weeks later, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., a concert was held. Marian Anderson sang at that concert. 75,000 people attended. And here is a picture of Mrs. Roosevelt meeting with her friend, Marian Anderson, after the concert. Eleanor Roosevelt did not go to the concert. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought they were buds. Wasn't she upset that she wasn't able to sing at Constitution Hall? Didn't she resign her membership in the DAR? Yes, yes, and yes. But she didn't go to the concert because she remembered back to 1905, March 17th. And this is, I get goosebumps every time I tell this story. And this is about the 80th time, this week I've told the story. I love this story because this tells you who Eleanor Roosevelt was. Eleanor Roosevelt recognized that on her wedding day, March 17th, 1905, Uncle Teddy stole away all the attention by being the big celebrity in the room, and Eleanor felt like a bit player in her own wedding. She remembers that lesson, and she's not able to apply it until Easter Sunday, 1939. She doesn't want to go to the concert because she knows if she does, the newsreels will be, Eleanor Roosevelt attends concert for some African-American woman. We don't know, right? But she wants her to be the center of attention. And I love that story because there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of stories like that that speak to who Eleanor Roosevelt was as a person. She also took an interest in the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, this was a group of African-American men who wanted to be pilots in the military. Many of them already were pilots in civilian life, but when they joined up to the Army Air Corps, they weren't allowed to fly planes because they were Black. And there was a 1925 Army War College report that said Blacks were not intelligent enough to do much in the Army other than drive trucks and peel potatoes. Okay, that's, there's your inherent racism right there, right? So these guys said, well, that's not true. We can fly planes. We can do what we can do it as well as anybody else. And so a little experiment was started where they took a group of these guys and they said, all right, let's see what you can do. So they took them to Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and they set them up in barracks that were sub barracks to what the white pilots had. They let them use the lousy equipment as opposed to the really good equipment that the white pilots had. And these guys began to organize themselves. They fixed the equipment, they spiffed up the barracks and such, and they really began to make a unit out of themselves. Mrs. Roosevelt found out about how well they were doing, and she went down there to visit them. So she went down to Tuskegee, Alabama. She visited with the Tuskegee Airmen, and she said, oh, I've heard so much about you. Tell me all about what you're doing. Tell me everything that's going on. And Chief Anderson, who was the head of the African-American Army Air Corps group at that time, said, well, Mrs. Roosevelt, probably the best way that we can show you what we do is to take you for a flight. Let me take you for a flight. Hop in the plane. So she hops in the plane and off they go. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt flies with these guys that aren't supposed to be smart enough to know how to fly a plane. The Secret Service almost faints, right? Oh my God, what are we doing? We're letting them fly with her? And she flies around for 20, 25 minutes. She comes down. Here's the picture that's taken when they land. You can see she is over the moon, as is Colonel Anderson. And she gets out and she says, these fellows can fly a plane just as well as anyone. And that was a huge step and a huge endorsement and a huge boost for the Tuskegee Airmen. Now, I want to point out that Eleanor Roosevelt was also close personal friends with another pilot of the time, Amelia Earhart. And so Eleanor Roosevelt had flown with Amelia Earhart. They used to vacation together. They would go on picnics and things, the Earhart family and the Roosevelt family. So she knew good flying. And so when she endorsed these guys, it was a huge boost for them to, gain in respect and better treatment and better equipment and those sorts of things. When the Japanese-American internment took place in February of 1942, Mrs. Roosevelt spoke out against it. She said, hey, you can't be rounding up these guys and putting them into camps. That's not right. These aren't the ones that were flying the planes. These are regular American citizens. And Franklin Roosevelt told her, listen, we got to have a unified front on this, all right? You cannot speak out about this in public. I'm issuing this executive order. You need to not talk about this in public. And Eleanor said, okay, I won't talk about it in public. And she began to talk about it behind the scenes. And she went and she visited many of the camps, and she arranged furloughs for college-age kids that were in the camps to get out of the camps and go to colleges on the East Coast, where there was far less anti-Japanese sentiment. She, in 1940, was asked to speak at the renomination committee for President Roosevelt in Chicago. And she says, oh, that'd be kind of fun. I'll go do that. Sure. And she looks at the roster and she says, wow, awful lot of guys on here. I don't see too many women delegates. And she says, I don't think I want to go. I'm not going to go give the speech. And they're like, what? And she says, well, there's not enough women. I want more women delegates or I'm not going to give the speech. So guess what? In come the women delegates, getting women involved in politics at that level. And this was an important nomination in 1940 because it was Franklin Roosevelt running for the third term. And Eleanor Roosevelt gives a speech, and it's wonderful. Doris Kearns wrote a book called No Ordinary Time, and the title No Ordinary Time comes from that speech. Mrs. Roosevelt gets up there in front of the delegation in Chicago, and she's going to put her husband's name in nomination for the presidency. And they are talking about, she says, well, you shouldn't really run for a third term. because, and she lays out all these reasons, the George Washington, diddly-do, blah, skibbity-bip. And then she says, but that's in ordinary times. And these are no ordinary times. And then she goes and she readdresses everything she just laid out as to why you shouldn't, as to why Franklin Roosevelt should. And of course, he wins that historic election. Now, I'm not saying it was because specifically of her, but nonetheless, what it did was he trusted her so much that he allowed her to be at that convention on her terms with increased numbers of female delegates. And she gave this reasoning of why he shouldn't be president, and then completely turned it on his head and made the case for it. So she helped pave the way for women in politics, like women like Barbara Boxer, Christine Whitman, Geraldine Ferraro, Madeleine Albright, Elizabeth Dole, Bella Abzug, Hillary Clinton, AOC, Kamala Harris, right? All of these women can stand on the shoulders of Mrs. Roosevelt in their political parties because she brought more people to the table. Now, here comes turning point number 5. Franklin Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945. And she says, the story is over. And it was for about 2 weeks. And then she got right back on it. And she began to get involved in women's organizations, in African-American organizations. Harry Truman appoints her to be a delegate to the United Nations from the United States, and she gets on the Human Rights Committee, and she becomes the chairperson of the Human Rights Committee, and she almost single-handedly creates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, there were other people on the committee that made a lot of great contributions, but it was Mrs. Roosevelt who never gave up. One time they said, well, Mrs. Roosevelt, these meetings go awfully long, and it's just really tiring. And she said, well, they wouldn't go so long if you didn't talk so much. So get up there, say what you need to say, and we'll get the meetings to be shorter. She made them work through weekends. She made them work late into the night, to the point where they said, Mrs. Roosevelt, you're violating our human rights. I want to go home and be with my kid on his birthday. And she said, well, the sooner we wrap up our work, the sooner you're home with all your folks. So here she is with Harry Truman and 2 young delegates, pages types at the United Nations with the United Nations flag and President Harry S. Truman. So this, as I said earlier, is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there's quite a story behind that. Wink, wink, nod, nod. All right, 1960. The Democrats are running a young and inexperienced senator by the name of John F. Kennedy. He comes to New York, he meets with Mrs. Roosevelt, and he needs to get her endorsement for the presidency. He comes here in August of 1960, just a few months before the election, and Mrs. Roosevelt meets with him and puts his feet to the fire to include the civil rights planks in the platform for the 1960 Democratic Convention, which leads to things like the Voting Rights Act, the Housing Act, and these are things that are not passed during President Kennedy's time, but are passed when his vice president becomes president. So in addition to all of this, she was also a very large and noticeable presence and contributor to a bunch of other organizations. She was involved in the Women's League of Voters, the NAACP. She sat on their board for a period. She was a member of the Consumers League, the Democratic parties at the state and national level, the President Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women. She was a co-owner of the Todd Hunter School, where she taught. She ran a little company called Valkill Industries that taught young men how to make furniture. So if they couldn't make a job, let's say farming, they could make furniture. She was involved with the Women's Trade Union. And she was very involved in a number of other organizations. She also allowed herself to take part in advertising. So this was an interesting thing because what she did was she would allow she would endorse products. So she endorsed the American Cancer Society. She endorsed a certain type of hearing aids. At one point, she even endorsed a certain type of margarine. But she had in her contract, I will promote your product, but I will also be able to promote whatever else is on my mind. And if you cannot agree to that, I am not going to be your spokesperson. So, of course, who's going to turn down Eleanor Roosevelt? So the margarine thing didn't go so good. And you can Google this and look it up. So one day she's there and she's doing this margarine commercial. So, oh, look at the way this margarine spreads so easily upon this bread. Isn't it wonderful? Look how smooth it spreads. Speaking of spreading, atomic weapons are spreading around this world and we need to do something about it, right? So she just jumped right into a pitch for nuclear non-proliferation, right? That's who Mrs. Roosevelt was. Now, I asked her grandson, Curtis, one time, I said, why, how come she never ran for office? And he said she would never run for office because if she ran for office, she would have been tied to a constituency. Her constituency was her own conscience. She didn't want to have to be looking over her shoulder all the time. Oh, are the voters going to approve of this? Am I going to make the voters happy? She wanted to make her own conscience happy, her own ability to help other people. That's who she was serving. Now, what were some of the tools that she used? So let's take a look at that. One of the tools that Mrs. Roosevelt used, and it was tricky, and I like this, was a thing that she called a moral construct. Now, if you have an issue, it's always easy to come up with 1,000 reasons why you can't fix that issue, right? So let's say it's highways. Well, where are we going to get the funding? Who's going to do the job? How are we going to determine what roads get fixed? You know, what about insurance? What about unions? What about blah, 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 right? And it's easy to come up with this big pile of reasons why you can't do stuff. But Mrs. Roosevelt would listen to the objections, and then she would boil down the topic down to what she called a moral construct. But don't you think we need safe roads to drive on? And, you know, let's say Laura say, oh, yeah, we do need safe roads to drive on, right? Great, good, Laura. I'm glad we agree. You and I are now allies to get these highways built, right? So she would trap you into a yes or no thing. You know, school lunch programs, right? Well, don't you think that students should have good, healthy meals in schools? Well, of course I do. Great. Then you're going to work with me to get the unions and the farmers and the, you know, all the other people involved in this stuff. So by breaking it down to a simple yes or no question, and then having you say yes, she pulled you in as a partner. And when she pulled you in as a partner, she held you as a partner, right? There was no backing out. Well, you know, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm really beginning to think of these folks. Now, you said that you believed in this and that we were partners and that we're going to move this forward. And how do you say no to Eleanor Roosevelt? Answer, you don't. Right? So you find a way to work with it. So the moral construct, love that. She also used a method called personification. And this is something that we now see quite a bit of. And you probably have seen this if you've ever watched the State of the Union address since, let's say, the Reagan administration. But the president gets up there, he's going to give a State of the Union. And then at one point, he points up to the gallery. And up there in the gallery, sitting with the First Lady is Fireman of the Year, or Teacher of the Year, or Dog Catcher of the Year. And then they pan over and there's, you know, the dog catcher or the fireman or the teacher. And they look like the guy that lives down the street from you, don't they? Right? They look like a regular, everyday, ordinary guy. And that's what Mrs. Roosevelt did as well. She used this method of personification. She did not like to speak in percentages. She liked to speak in personalities. So rather than say something like, well, 30% of the farmers don't have electricity, right? Because 30% is a number, right? And farmers is a group. But what she would say is, I'd like to introduce you to Old MacDonald and his family. This is his wife. That's their son, Ronald, who would later go on to make a fortune in the hamburger industry. You know, this is the MacDonald family. And they have no electricity. When the sun goes down, they can't read. So their kid is falling behind and started dressed like a clown. They can't do this, because they don't have when they lay eggs, they have to get that eggs right to market. When the cows make the milk, they don't have electricity. And when you're looking in the eyes of old MacDonald and his family, right, and his little boy Ronald, and you're seeing the worry in their face, you're seeing the wrinkles and the stress on their face, you're feeling their presence, their humanity. It is a lot harder for you to say no. And so what she would do is she would not speak in statistics, she would speak in personalities. I don't want to talk about 30% of farmers. Here's a farming family. They can tell you what's going on. They can tell you what the problem is. And that has a huge, huge thing. People use it in advertising all the time, testimonials, right? And they're fake. Like they're just, the woman in the kitchen. Oh, hi. Oh, I've just cleaned my sink with blah, 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 right? Now, that there's not a crew in the kitchen watching a woman, it's a commercial. They made it up. But because they've got this typical housewife that's in there doing this, right? You buy it, right? Personification. She also used a method called, she called it associative circles and cross-pollination. So what she would do is she would go to places, and anytime she would talk to somebody, she would try to connect them with somebody else, right? So for example, she might say, well, Laura, I was at this event the other day, and I know you're looking to expand these programs, and there's a person that I think would be wonderful to do these programs for you, and their name is blah, 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 blah. You should call them. And then the next time she saw that guy, she'd say, wow, there's this woman named Laura who's looking for people to do, you know what? I'm going to have her call you. And she would connect these people up, right? You know how in every organization, that you're a member of, you ever notice there's like 40 or 50 people in the organization, and there's always the same 5 people doing everything, right? You know how that is, right? There's 15 people on the committee, and, 3 of them do the work and 5 others complain about everything. Mrs. Roosevelt was one of those people that did the work, and she connected other people that did the work so the work could get done. And because she had spent 7 years going around the country, she knew literally tens of thousands of people, and she was able to connect folks into networks that were able to do what it was that they needed to do. She also, at that time, was involved in what we would today call media, right? She had total media involvement. Mrs. Roosevelt wrote a My Day column, 3,000 of them over the course of decades. Mrs. Roosevelt gave hundreds of radio announcements, thousands of interviews, hundreds of articles, hundreds of personal appearances. She was in the newsreels. She was on the radio. She was in the newspaper. She was in the women's magazines. She was on in the bookstores because she was writing books. And every time Mrs. Roosevelt made a statement or did one of these things, it was difficult for her. You have to understand how difficult it was. Every time she stepped in front of a camera, she could hear her mother calling her granny, right, from back in the day. Every time she stepped in front of a microphone, she knew she had that high little voice. When she wrote her My Day columns, when she wrote her books, she understood that she only had the equivalence of a high school diploma. So, when you're writing and you're like, oh, do I use a colon, a semicolon, an esophagus? What do I use here, right? That's the kind of questions she was always asking herself. She never thought of herself as a public speaker. She never thought of herself as a public figure. She never thought of herself as a writer. She thought of herself as someone who had a story to tell for other people who were on the outside looking in and had no one to tell their story, had no one to be their voice. And that's what Mrs. Roosevelt did. Now, it's very interesting. Last week, here's a right off hot off the press. Last week, they introduced the Roosevelt Quarter, Eleanor Roosevelt Quarters. I don't know if you're familiar with this, from the U.S. Mint. And Eleanor Roosevelt's great-granddaughter was here, a young, beautiful young woman by the name of Perrin. And when I say beautiful, I don't mean just physically, but she's just smart, she's bright, she's out there, she's happening. And she described her grandmother as possibly being a time-bending witch. Like, what? Because she was able to get so much stuff done. So parent was like, I don't know. I mean, I'm busy all the time. I'm doing a million things. I'm getting nothing done compared to what great granny did. She must have been able to bend time somehow and do these things. And what Mrs. Roosevelt had was she had created what she called an inner peace, a place for inner peace. And she had this way of centering herself. Right. So when she was nervous, when she was upset, when she was worried, when she realized she was up against huge, huge odds of getting anything done, rather than get nervous and upset, she would pull herself in, and she would pull herself into this oasis place, this oasis of peace within herself. And she created this inner oasis that she could access even in just a few minutes, or sometimes for extended periods of time. And she was able to push out the chaos, create the peace, focus and center on what her message was, what she wanted to say, how she wanted to say it, and most importantly, how important it was that the message got said. So she had this ability to comfort herself and to pull herself together in that place. Then the final technique she used is she literally never stopped moving, right? She never stopped moving. When she would go to an event, she would, they had, let's say it was a luncheon, right? She would sit down, she'd eat her lunch, then she would get up as soon as she was done and begin to move around the room. And she did this so that she could meet as many people as she possibly could. But she also realized early on in her career that if you stay still, you get pigeonholed. Right. So this is like you guys, right? You're going to, it's summertime, and this may already have happened this season. So you're going to go to a family event and you sit down and you got your burger and your potato salad and your beer. And here comes Uncle Charlie. Here comes Uncle Charlie. He comes over and he plops right down to you, right next to you. And he starts telling you the time that he lost a job at the, the Oldsmobile factory, and it wasn't his fault. Something that happened like in the 1950s, right? And he's still obsessed by this thing, and there's no way to get away from Uncle Charlie. Eleanor Roosevelt was constantly being bombarded by Uncle Charlies, and she knew that if she stood still, they would dominate her time with their story. So she made sure that she would keep moving, and as she moved, Uncle Charlie would have to keep up with her. And while he was keeping up with her, other people would come in and they would tend to dissipate out that Uncle Charlie. So it wasn't that she was blowing him off. She was just allowing him to have only a fraction of her time because she realized that other people in that room also needed some of her time. So she kept on moving. That's why I never, ever sit down at any kind of family event or any of those sorts of things. I have mastered the ability to have the plate in one hand. I have the beer in my pocket. I'm able to walk around. And that way, when I see Uncle Charlie come in, and I know I'm going to hear the Oldsmobile story for the 400th time, and how his life could have been so much better if he had just gotten that job, and he doesn't understand why he didn't get, that whole thing, right? So you got to keep moving. You got to keep going. Mrs. Roosevelt understood that. So this is why we're talking about this woman, 65 years or so, 60 years after her death, because she was an incredible person who took upon herself the hardships, the pain, the sorrow, and the tasks and the mission of others. And she brought those people to the table. She brought those people to the center. She brought those people to the argument and made sure that at least part of their story was being heard and that they were not voiceless. Speaking of voices, let's open it up to Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I do have one question. I think Fran has a question.
Sure.
Fran, you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. Am I off mute? Yeah.
Yep. Hi, Fran.
First, thank you. It was just marvelous, and my wrist is sore from writing.
Oh.
I wrote
Oh, I thought maybe from going like this, one of the, no, that's good.
know about these qualities. For instance, how do we know she had this inner peace that she went into? What documents tell us these things?
She writes about them. She writes about them in her book. She wrote over 24 books. She wrote 2 autobiographies. Because she wasn't quite done with everything for the first one. And she writes about these things in her books. She writes over 24 books, and they're on everything from parenting to the United Nations to, you name it. She had an interest in it. She would write about it, and she would tell about, her experiences. She would tell about her ideas, and she would tell about the things that she learned from other people. So one of the books she wrote, I think it actually, I may not be right on this, but I think it came out after she died. But it was the last book she was writing, was You Learn by Living. And the whole idea is, she tells basically, look, here's some of these things I've learned over the course of my life. Here's what we got going on. So she tells us this in her books. She tells us in her My Day columns, and she really points out a lot of things that are actually quite obvious if you just stop and take a look, but most people don't. Because most people are not Eleanor Roosevelt.
Thank you. Which book would you suggest if you wanted to learn about her? Would you suggest the Doris Kearns book?
Yeah, I would start with one of her autobiographies, one of her 2 autobiographies, right? Because she's telling about herself. Doris Kearns does a wonderful job of talking about Mrs. Roosevelt. You could read Mrs. Roosevelt's actual books, which, there's a lot of good insight into her. And there's a guy by the name of Joe Lash, Lash, who has he's no longer with us, but he was a college student that was very good friends with Mrs. Roosevelt, and he wrote a lot about her. And he lived with her, he traveled with her, so he's got a lot of good insight, and it's all, on the up and up because, he spent so much time with her. Trusted friend.
Thank you.
Sure.
Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, I'm going to throw my question out.
Okay.
So when Eleanor is working on behalf of Franklin and he's recuperated and trying to rebuild his strength for 7 years, where does everyone think Franklin is? What did they think he's doing? I mean, did they tell the truth, or was there some cover story?
No, they told the truth. They said he was back in Hyde Park, tending to the estate, which he was, and trying to regain his strength. Everybody knew that Franklin Roosevelt had polio. There's this misconception that people didn't know, or that he hid it. He did not hide it. He downplayed it. Okay, he didn't want people talking about what he couldn't do. He wanted people talking about what he could do. And so, he was back home, regaining his upper body strength. And, the idea was, Franklin can't be with you here today because, he's working on his exercises or whatever, but here's what he wanted me to tell you. And so there you go, right? And, keep in mind, it wasn't the world of mass media like it is today. So, you could tell somebody that in Albuquerque and then go tell them in Poughkeepsie and then Peoria and wherever. And, it's not a lie. He's working on regaining his health. He sent her out there to make these announcements and things. And that's the story, so it was when he did get back out into the public, he used a lot of little tricks to downplay his disability. You weren't supposed to take pictures of him in a wheelchair. There's only 5 pictures of him in a wheelchair. So there was some, a little bit of smoke and mirrors, but mostly it was talk about what I am doing, not about what I'm not doing. I'm not standing up, but I'm running a country.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing.
A lot of people were shocked, because it just wasn't covered that much in the media, but
No.
I guess it was considered a courtesy.
Yeah, it wasn't important, right? It wasn't important. It's we were more focused on policy and things that mattered back in the day than personality and those sorts of things. Now he gets some criticism from that later on, because a lot of disability groups say that why didn't he talk more about it? Well, because he didn't want to make it an issue. That wasn't the issue. And so sometimes disability groups will think, well, if he had made it more of an issue, it would have raised the visibility and all that.
Right.
Well, the guy was a 4-term president of the United States that got us through a Great Depression and a Second World War. That's pretty darn visible.
Yes. Yes, he was a hero to a lot of people.
Absolutely.
You have Craig Abbott from Texas, who you almost never see his disability. He's in a wheelchair.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because it just doesn't really matter that much anymore. If you're focusing, I mean, it matters obviously to the person and it matters to people around them. But the thing is, we need to focus on people's abilities, not disabilities. And if you think about the things that you can do and the things you can't do, there's probably a lot more things that you can't do. And you don't want people talking about that. I always describe it to the children when they come in, we work with a lot of kids, is let's say you're playing kickball and, you get up to kick and the first time you kick, your ball goes right by you and you fall flat on your back, right? That used to happen to me a lot. And then let's say you get up another time and you kick the ball and it goes right over the fence into the highway, home run. What do you want people talking about? Do you want people talking about, hey, there's that guy that falls flat on his back every time? Or do you want them talking about the home run that you made? And that's what Roosevelt was focusing on. Let's talk about the home run. Let's talk about what we're doing that's working, what's working and what's helping people and making things right. That's what we need to talk about. And that's not, deceptive or anything like that, but it's just, let's take the lessons from this and we'll apply them to something that's not working so well.
Okay, anything else? Because I think we're ready to wrap up, but we really, really appreciate you coming back and giving us a wrap up on obviously Eleanor Roosevelt as well as FDR before her. And I guess we're going to talk about the 75th anniversary or 75th anniversary of the Human Rights Commission.
Oh, is that this year? Completely forgot about that. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, I'll have to get working later. I'll get working on that. Thanks, everybody. So sorry about what happened last time. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being a great audience. Thanks for wanting to learn. And thank you, Laura, for making me do these things.
Oh, I think somebody's
hijacking us.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. We'll see you next time, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
It was a wonderful discussion, very, very thorough and excellently presented. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye, everybody.